Hey everybody, Tony here with part two of the supply and demand series. Last week we talked about what exactly supply and demand is, where these zones come from, the difference between supply and demand zones and support and resistance zones, and how they intertwine with one another, and kind of why, those zones are important. In this week's episode, I want to talk about um, identifying zones, how to draw them, and some time frame stuff in terms of what time frames am I identifying and drawing these zones on. Um, like I said, gonna try to keep this around 10 minutes or so. But let's get right into it. If you need to watch the first episode from last week, that is posted in Discord and on my YouTube channel. So that's where you'll be able to find that first part. This is part two, and I first want to start off with identifying potential zones and identifying areas where we may be able to implement a zone. So essentially, we're looking for reversals in the chart, whether something's in an uptrend, sellers take control, or something sells off and it creates a reversal, or vice versa. Something is in a downtrend, buyers step in, and they create a reversal. Now, it is very important to note that, one, there are going to be times where it is very hard to identify zones on specific time frames. When I am implementing my zones, say I'm doing some prep the night before or during pre-market, I like to start with maybe the 30-minute or the hourly. Those higher time frames are something that I've used for quite a while and really enjoy using when it comes to drawing zones and identifying zones. We're currently on the Apple 10-minute chart. Let's hop over to the 30-minute. And essentially, guys, what I'm looking for is, like I said, those peaks and valleys, the reversals to go ahead and implement zones. Now, we can see if we go back to, let's pull this down. If we go back to this flush out from the 21st of September into the next day during pre-market at 8:30, we can see, Apple flushed out overnight, during after hours, then in the morning, had a little jump towards that 20 EMA on the 30-minute, got rejected. 9 o'clock hits into open, we flush out, and then we bounce back. So if I'm looking at this chart, guys, I'm trying to look for areas or reversal areas like we were talking about. So I see this first reversal happens here. What am I looking for in terms of drawing and implementing this zone? Well, I will at all times start my zone from the very top or bottom of a wick, and majority of the time bring it up to the body. Now, it's important to note that when you're drawing these zones, there's going to be times where you have, a wick that's bigger than another wick. You're going to have ones that are maybe relative in size. You're going to have a candle like this here from the 23rd of September that there is no wick. A lot of the times you will get a wick to start your zone at. Sometimes you will not. That's when it can be a little bit difficult to draw zones, but I will show how I would draw this lower zone with there not being any wick. So I would go ahead and take my tool with whatever charting platform I'm using. I'm using TradingView. You can do this on anything. You can do this on Webull. You can do this on TD, Thinkorswim, whatever platform you're using. I'm going to go ahead in here, and I'm going to take this rectangular tool, okay, and I'm going to go from wick to the body. Now, if we're disregarding this information here, guys, this zone looks good, okay? We're going ahead and drawing this zone in before this ever happens. What's so important to recognize with this is, look what happens once this makes a move back into this zone. It's almost exact to a T where we reject. Okay, let's zoom in here. We reject right off the top of that zone that we implemented. So, going ahead and doing this in real time, as soon as we see this flush out happen and putting this zone in right away and identifying it right away, this, would have played out very nicely. So this would be supply, and supply, we need to think of supply as resistance, okay? Now, if I'm going, I see we flush out. Now, my next thing I'm looking for, guys, is another reversal. So I want to see, if buyers step in to this Apple chart at all, I want to then go ahead and implement support or a demand zone. Now, like we were talking about, you're never going to have, a wick that's the same size. Sometimes they're going to be bigger than others. Sometimes they're going to be, small. This is a little bit smaller of a wick. What would I do? I'd start it at the very start of the candlestick, and I would finish it at the body of that following candle. In this instance, it was the first candle, and in this case, these candle bodies start at the relatively the same point. So I'm going in there and I'm extending this and considering this demand. Now, we can see from this chart, okay, once the 23rd hit during pre-market, we gap down through this zone. So there is never a chance to interact with this zone. I'm going to touch on in a future episode of this series what happens when we get a gap through a zone. That was a question I had, and this is a good example. I'll go over this in maybe the next episode or the episode after that. What do we do when there's a gap through a zone? In this case, there was no chance for price action to potentially react to that. But I would keep this zone in. We can see, here at 9 o'clock into 9:30, we make a move and try to confirm above this zone and are unable to. We start working our way down again, etc. So I have my zones in, okay, and this was using the 30-minute. Now, I mentioned earlier, what do we do if maybe the reversal doesn't yield a wick? Well, guys, it's at times you're going to get stuff like this. You may get a tweezer bottom that doesn't really yield a wick to go ahead and start your zone from. If we look at this candle from, what time is this? 2:30. I would still start this at the start of the candle wick. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this up to the body of the previous candle. Once I drop this down to a lower time frame, like the 10-minute, 5-minute, I'll see if this looks sufficient enough. But that's where I would draw this specific zone where the reversal started. Gives me a decent size zone to look and play around. Now, the second thing I want to talk about, guys, is once I implement these support and resistance areas, these supply and demand zones, okay, we're using the 30-minute here, what do I do? Well, I'll start dropping it down to the other time frames that I look at. So with the 5, 10, 3-minute, we'll first start with the 10-minute. Alls I want to see, guys, is does this look accurate? Am I missing anything? Am I maybe missing information I wasn't able to see on that longer time frame? Maybe potentially a wick, an important wick somewhere where I should extend the zone a little bit. In this instance, guys, what I would do is, since we did wick through this zone, I would go ahead and bring this zone up, okay? Now, okay, this is Apple. This is Sunday, the 25th. Tomorrow morning, I want to see, does this zone hold up? Maybe we gap up through, and that's something I'll talk about, like I said, in another episode. Or maybe, we range during pre-market, and maybe we see interaction with these zones, right at the open or during the day. Excuse me, during the day at some point. So that's why these dropping it down to a lower time frame that you use, like the 3, 5, 10, whatever you prefer, whatever you use when you trade, is important. So I'm not missing information like this. I want to make sure that this zone accommodates that wick, and then I'll move from there, see if I do get an interaction with this zone or not. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. We'll see, like I said. But that's how I go in and I draw these zones. And that's how I use these time frames. Now, if you trade off the 5-minute chart, I'm not saying go in and draw a zone on the 30-minute or the hourly and trade off the 30-minute or the hourly. I'm simply saying those are the time frames. A higher time frame is going to help you better identify a zone. And those are the ones that I use. Now, in the next episode, guys, I'm going to talk about how to play around these zones. Like I mentioned before, about what happens when you get a gap up or gap down through a zone. In a future episode, I'm going to talk about how the zones can flip. I'm going to talk about, identifying a potential liquidity grab through a zone, and is the zone still valid, and vice versa, waiting for confirmation. There's a lot to cover. We're running at about 10, 11, 12 minutes here with this episode. That's kind of the time I want to keep it to. So yeah, that's the second episode of this supply and demand series. If you have questions, please reach out to me. I, as always, hope this helps. If you have any questions, guys, I will answer them. You send me a message in chat or whatever the case may be. And like I said, I really hope this helps, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.